The Vantage Institute for Temporal Navigation had been training jump navigators for 210 years. It sat in permanent orbit above Station Offren, a structure older than most of the fleets it supplied officers to, and its reputation was built on a single number: 58%. That was the graduation rate, not because the coursework was long, though it was. Because the discipline it taught manual jump window calculation, the art of computing the precise mathematical threshold at which a ship could safely translate across folded space without an onboard AI doing the work for you, had a floor built into it by physics itself. That floor was called the threshold constant. Every species in the Coalition had, at some point in their history, tried to calculate a jump window faster than the accepted minimum. Every species had failed. The number had stood, unchallenged, for longer than most of the Institute's alumni had been alive. It was taught not as a target, but as a wall, the point past which biological cognition simply could not go, the reason every capital ship carried redundant AI processors as a matter of law rather than convenience. In 24 years, the Institute had admitted 9 humans. 3 had graduated. The current class had 1. Ren Aether was 19, from a mining collective strung along the outer belt of a system with no name the Coalition had bothered to catalog, where ships jumped manually because AI processors were expensive and asteroid haulers were not worth insuring with them. Admissions officer Callum Irish had read Ren's application 3 times. The first time, the numbers in the practical evaluation section had looked like a formatting error, a decimal point in the wrong place, a training log that had been corrupted somewhere in transit. The second time, he had requested the raw telemetry directly from the training vessel's black box, rather than the summary the applicant had submitted. The third time, after independent verification came back from 2 separate fleet auditors, he had simply sat with the file open for 11 minutes before forwarding it to the registrar. Ren had not mentioned any of this in the interview. When asked about navigation experience, the answer given was, "I did the family's supply runs for 4 years. Someone had to do the math before the ship redlined the fuel window." No elaboration. No context offered about what the math had looked like, or how fast it had been done, or what it might mean inside a 210-year-old building built entirely around the idea that a wall existed and no one could see past it. Ren arrived at the Institute with a single piece of luggage and a battered analog wrist chronometer, the kind that had to be wound by hand, worn on the left wrist beneath the uniform sleeve where regulations said nothing about jewelry because no one had ever tried to bring one. It had belonged to a grandmother who navigated by hand before there were names for what she was doing. Ren found the assigned quarters, unpacked in under 10 minutes, and reported to the first navigation lab an hour before the scheduled start time. The challenge came on the 3rd week, in the shared study hall after a practical exam, in front of 11 other cadets. Cadet Isvorak was a Draylen, 4th year, ranked first in the current cohort by a margin wide enough that instructors had stopped mentioning 2nd place by name. Vorak had the kind of standing that came from 3 consecutive years of the highest simulated jump scores the Institute had recorded that decade, and the kind of certainty that came from never having that standing questioned. Vorak introduced the question the way certain cadets introduce questions, which is to say, with the timing and tone of someone who had prepared it in advance, waiting for an audience large enough to make it worth asking. Aether. Out of curiosity, a pause calibrated. Your species doesn't grow up with onboard AI where you're from, does it? Supply runs, hand math. Another pause, this one performing thoughtfulness rather than containing it. So purely academic, how long does it actually take you? To run a full jump window calculation, manually, best time. Several cadets smiled. It was the particular kind of smile that happens in rooms where a hierarchy is quietly being enforced, and everyone present has already decided which side of it they're standing on. Not cruelty, just certainty wearing a friendly expression. Instructor Kaylee's Thorne, seated at the head of the table reviewing exam scores, said nothing. He had pulled Ren's training telemetry from fleet records in the 2nd week, cross-referenced it twice, and had been waiting since then for the right moment to let a discussion find its own way to this question. He did not look up. He did not need to. "That's a reasonable question," Ren said, in the tone of someone who genuinely found it reasonable, setting down a stylus without any particular urgency. "Are you asking about a supply run window or a combat tempo window? They're scored differently." Vorak blinked, recalibrating slightly, then recovering the timing. Let's say combat tempo, the kind that would actually matter. Ren thought about it for a moment, the way someone thinks about a number they already know but want to state correctly. 9.1 seconds. The room did not respond immediately, because the room did not yet understand what it had heard. The threshold constant. The wall, the floor, the number every cadet in that hall had been taught since their first semester as the boundary of what a biological mind could achieve, was 11.4. The smiles stopped the way a wave stops, the ones closest to Ren first, then spreading outward toward the back of the hall. Vorak's smile held a half-second longer than the rest, the particular half-second of someone still deciding whether they'd misheard. That's below the constant. Below what I was told the constant was, Ren said. I didn't know it had a name until I got here. Where I'm from, we just called it fast enough not to die. It was Instructor Thorn who finally spoke, closing the exam file in front of him with a quiet, deliberate motion. Since the second week of this term, I have had Cadet Ockhaffers training telemetry on file, verified independently by 2 fleet auditors and cross-checked against the raw black box recordings of 11 separate supply runs. I was waiting for the appropriate context to bring it forward. I believe we have found one. He activated the hall's display without further comment. The footage was not dramatic in the way Academy training simulations were dramatic, with their clean interfaces and stylized failure states. It was documentary. Grainy black box video from the interior of an aging supply hauler, timestamp burned into the corner, a younger Ren strapped into a jump seat with the same battered chronometer visible on one wrist, calculating a full jump window by hand, while alarms indicated a closing fuel margin in the background. Thorn narrated only the numbers, letting the footage carry the rest. Run 1, cargo vessel Half Moon Ferry, an emergency jump executed under active fuel pressure failure. Time to completed verified window. 8.9 seconds. The second clip showed a different ship, a different alarm, the same steadiness. Run 2, a jump calculated while the vessel was actively venting atmosphere from a hull breach. 9.3 seconds. By the third clip, no one in the hall was smiling. Run 3. This one was flagged by fleet auditors as statistically improbable and independently re-verified twice before being accepted into record. A jump window calculated during an unscheduled pirate intercept, under direct threat, with 2 other crew members' survival contingent on the timing being correct. 8.6 seconds. Vorak had gone very still, watching with the expression of someone doing a calculation that was going to take considerably longer than the remainder of the class period to finish. Run 4, Thorn continued. A training exercise, deliberately unscheduled, requested by this institute's own verification office as an independent test rather than a self-reported figure. Supervised. Recorded on institute equipment this time. 9.01 seconds. Run 5. A pause, the only pause Thorn allowed himself in the entire recitation. Requested again, 6 days later, by a second and separate fleet auditor who did not believe the first result. 8.8 seconds. The hall was silent in the specific way. A room goes silent when the people in it are recalculating, individually and privately, everything they had assumed to be true about the walls of their own discipline. No one asked a question, no one needed to. The numbers were doing all of the talking in a language that did not require translation. Ren did not speak during any of it. There was no need to. This was not a moment that belonged to commentary. It belonged to the footage, and to the room absorbing what the footage meant, and Ren simply sat with hands folded, watching the same clips as everyone else, as if seeing the numbers confirmed rather than performed. Vorak's rankings, everyone in the hall now understood without it being said aloud, were about to require a footnote. Class ended without ceremony. Cadets filed out in a silence that had shifted registers somewhere in the last 10 minutes, from the silence of enforced hierarchy to the silence of people quietly revising a worldview. Vorak stopped at the door back to the room and did not turn around. 8.6 seconds is inside a margin most captains wouldn't authorize as a training scenario. A pause. The number in the manual is wrong or outdated. I'm not certain which yet. Both probably, Ren said, not unkindly. Vorak left without further comment, which was, everyone in the hall understood, its own kind of acknowledgement. There had been no confrontation, no argument to win or lose. There was simply a number that had changed, and a person who now had to live with a slightly larger universe than the one they'd walked into the hall with. Ren gathered a stylus, a datapad, and stood, the old chronometer catching the light for a half-second as a sleeve shifted back into place. Instructor Thorne remained at the head of the table, and for a moment the two registers of the man were visible side by side, the precise neutrality he'd worn through the entire demonstration, and something warmer underneath it now that the room had emptied. "You could have led with the numbers in week 1, Thorne said. Saved everyone the theater. Didn't seem like my place to correct the manual before anyone asked," Ren said. Seemed like it'd sound like bragging. "It would have. That's why I waited." Thorne almost smiled at that, the closest expression he allowed himself to anything resembling amusement. He pulled up the cohort's standing performance record, found Ren's entry, and opened the field reserved for instructor notes. A field that, in 210 years of institute records, had rarely been used for anything but disciplinary flags and graduation recommendations. He typed 3 words and closed the file.